The heroes have entered a hidden cave entrance to a hostile fort. Attacked by eels and now seafolk, they are unsure of why these enemies are here. Are they working with the Vellecans, or are they new enemies? Only time will tell. Hey guys, welcome back to the second campaign diary for Renegades on a Vellecan Sea, my new campaign I've started with my gaming buddies online. If you didn't watch the first campaign diary and you want to know how we got to where we are now, feel free to go back and watch that when it's on this channel, and so far the response has been pretty good to it. So the players ended in the last session with killing what they find out is essentially a patrol from within the caves, from further within the caves. They're slightly beat up, but they know they have as much time as they want to take care of the whole mission here with the fort, because they can signal their ship with these scrolls that have the sending spell on them. If you're new to Dungeons and Dragons, the sending spell essentially lets you send a short message to someone as long as you know that person. And there's a small chance, I believe, that if they're on a different plane of existence, it doesn't send. But in general, you won't have issues with that. The players decide not to rest, which I found a little bit interesting. They instead heal up using some potions and stuff, and they push on. To be fair, they did point out something I hadn't even thought of, but that I thought was a good point. What if the patrol is supposed to come back? What if the patrol doesn't show up? Whoever's up ahead might realize that the patrol is gone and come look. As they enter into the Elven Ruins section of the dungeon, they immediately hear and see flickering lights in the distance. From more Seafolk they hear. Obviously the Seafolk speak their own language, and the group doesn't speak Seafolk, but they can recognize it, having dealt with them before. However, they also see a glimmer of metal coming down a side hallway. Upon closer examination, it's an unrusted sword, a saber, sitting next to a dead Seafolk in a small side room. The players decided to investigate this first, and this is not what I expected, and we'll get to what I expected later on in this video. Dark vision became more of a factor here. This tiny room, which turns out to basically be a crypt, is not lit at all. The players cautiously enter, and I describe how a bunch of dead bodies and old bones are lying around, including the fresh Seafolk corpse. This should have been a red flag to the players, but they didn't really seem too scared and continued to investigate, which I thought was interesting. For instance, think about it like this. Why would the Seafolk, who are one room over, essentially, leave the body of their comrade to sit in this room unless there was something in this room? I described how several other of the weapons are rusted in this room, but the saber noticeably isn't. It was quite shiny, in fact, glistening in the light, which signaled to the players, correctly so, that this is a magic weapon, and of course it is. There were also magical scribblings on the wall. I described them as basically engraved on the wall in some means, with some magical means that will let them stay on the wall long after they would have faded. And only one member of the party can actually read it, or actually I believe two of them, but only one was in the room at the time. Because these are written in Elvish, again, they're in Elvish ruins, and there are Elvish scribblings on the wall that are fairly old, and it all makes sense so far. Gemdulfo is the only one who can read them, and he reads it in his head at first, and it says, "If you are reading this, you have stumbled upon my final words and testimony. If ye be elves or friends of elven kind, read on. If ye be human, it's already too late. May my cursed soul take thee. For weeks now they've sat outside our wall in their ramming ships. That bitch Theophania sold us out. An eternal curse upon her. I have no choice. I hear them above, breaching the doors. It's too late for me. But my spirit will haunt them forever, and this fort will be the grave of their men. If you've read this far and lived, it means my spirit has moved on. Please, I beg of you to take breeze and destroy Vellecan. Destroy the Tiberian betrayers. Destroy those who betrayed my kind." Of course, this inscription was mostly flavor with a little bit of useful information, but I think that maybe in character or maybe out of character, Gemdulfo, played by my buddy Dreg, was a bit too precious with the implications of the inscription, and he didn't think that this would be useful information to share. The fact that it says, if you're reading this, it's already too late. Rightfully so, he says, well, I'm a halfling. Why would I share this with the group? It says, if you're human, then you should watch out and be gone. But I'm a halfling. Of course, he's with two other humans in the group who are standing right next to him and can't read yet. So a little too. I thought that was. I do think it was in character. I think obviously the players didn't care when after a moment something will happen, and we'll get to that in a moment. So I did kind of prompt him or kind of ask him, like, "Are you going to read to the group?" And he's like, "Yeah, I'll read it to the group." And of course, because I'm a dick, as soon as he read "If ye be human, it's already too late," a spectral figure rises from one of the sarcophagi in the room, and this, of course, is some sort of ghostly figure. It's not actually a ghost. In D&D, there are a lot of different creatures. There's ghosts, ghouls, banshees, ghasts. There's a bunch of different kind of variations of undead. This is a banshee, which is a bit of a challenge for the group. It is a challenge rating 4 creature against a level 3 party. Essentially what that means is a challenge rating 4 creature should be a normal encounter for a group of 4th level characters. This is a CR4, so again, meant for 4th level characters, but these are level 3 characters. However, I had faith that they would be fine because the action economy in 5th edition is pretty important, and there are 4 players, including one who has a familiar, and there is only one monster, one bad guy, at least for right now, and we'll get to that. Banshees are similar to Ghost, with the big difference being that, unlike Ghost, Banshees cannot possess people. And instead of having a horrible, or I think it's called a horrifying visage that ages the PCs, which is, I always thought, kind of a little lame, that as a Ghost, if you put a Ghost up against the players, they could literally age their characters by 30 years or something like that, right? And that's kind of lame to change literally the whole life of one of your player characters. Unlike that, Banshees just have a terrifying visage that doesn't have that sort of metagame effect, but if you fail your saving throw against the Banshee's wail, then you drop to 0 HP instantly and begin your death saving throws. And that's pretty brutal in its own way. The DC is only 13 for that, mind you, so it's not too bad. It's not too dangerous for a group of players who have bonuses to their DC, to their Constitution saving throws. Actually, it might be Wisdom. I don't remember. But either way, you get the idea. The players have some benefits. As the fight breaks out, the group realizes that this might, or definitely will, alert whoever's in that other room. Because keep in mind, unlike Ghosts, which can kind of sneak up on you, Banshees, their whole deal is that they scream, and they scream loud. Cleverly, Kragox realized that he had some equipment, and on his first turn, he goes to the entrance of this side area, which is a dead end, and he throws down some caltrops to slow down anyone who might come to investigate. And also, presumably, if they run into caltrops and like get their feet poked, they're probably going to yell out in pain. It could be a warning to the rest of the group. I actually awarded him inspiration for this because I thought it was a clever use of equipment, and I think a lot of times, at least in my experience being a player, then when you get all the starting equipment, including caltrops and ball bearings, which he, to be fair, I think he actually even bought them. I don't think he actually started with them. Lots of times you won't be able to find an easy use for them, but the fact that he found a quite useful and smart use I thought was very impressive, and I awarded inspiration because I thought it was clever and was worth rewarding. On her first round, the Banshee uses one of her actions to frighten Verdin, the human paladin, and Watna, the dwarven artificer. Verdin stays and fight, but Watna runs after Cyrus to the other room that leads into this one. After a couple of rounds of the Banshee beating up on Verdin and them going back and forth, with Gamdulfo running in between her legs and all around to try to distract her, she lets out her horrible scream, using her aforementioned ability. Only Cyrus is knocked out in the other room. It wasn't actually that bad for the players. However, the players insisted that if any of the other enemies ahead in the other room could hear her, that they should also be affected. And I read the description. It said any affected creature within 30 feet that can hear her, and it's a loud scream, so definitely, even though they're in a different room, they can hear her. Any creature within 30 feet that can hear her is going to be affected. Luckily for me, that was only one of the other Seafolk that are hiding in the next room. Not hiding, but chilling in the next room. And, of course, they failed their save and dropped dead. And the way that death works for players is a little different. There's no really rules for monsters, or maybe there are, but I rule it in general, that unless the players really want to take someone alive, the enemies will instantly die when they hit 0 HP. So this Seafolk dies in the other room. However, what the players are about to find out is that when you're chilling with your group of Seafolk friends and all of a sudden one of them drops dead from a monster you already knew was there, you are a bit suspicious of whatever's going on, and obviously this alerts the rest of the Seafolk. It tends to get your group's attention when something like this happens. So we'll come back to this because it will become important soon. Back in the tomb room, Vellecan realizes that the saber on the ground next to him is probably magical. Again, it is. And picks it up and starts slashing at the Banshee with it. And I describe that the magic of this saber slices through the Banshee a lot easier than the rest of the players' attacks. A lot of them have been shooting at it with crossbows, slashing at it with a rapier, or stabbing rather, and it hasn't been having as much effect as this saber that slashes right through. Watna, although not a cleric or bard or druid, does have cure wounds as an artificer using Jack often describes it as a bunch of salves and sort of magic-infused alchemical mixtures, which I think fits with my world and fits with kind of a more material-focused artificer rather than a magic-focused one. And so he goes over and heals up Cyrus, brings Cyrus back up, and the fight resumes. In the end, the fight doesn't turn out too bad. After a few rounds of them beating up on each other, the Banshee mostly focuses on Vellecan. It seems her hatred for humanity has not gone away in her thousands of years of undeath, or roughly 1,000, but still. The rest of the fight goes pretty well, and soon the Banshee loses her form, and that's how I describe death for a ethereal creature. And she is finally put to rest. Vellecan takes a second to read the inscription on the blade of the saber, and it reads, "Breeze," as you might have guessed. Now, after the Banshees wail, they hear movement and shouts from the other room, and they know that they are no longer secret. Obviously, this was a loud combat. They were only around kind of a U-turn bend from where they came, or from rather where they were going, where these other Seafolk presumably are. So what they decided to do here was, I thought, a little interesting. They could have ran out and gone and fought the Seafolk and probably had an easier time. But after the combat, they decided to hide in the entrance room behind their caltrops in this little offshoot. And kind of listening in. For a minute or two, they listen. They just sit there listening until they hear footsteps draw closer, stop, and then quickly go the other way. And they don't know this, but a highly trained Seafolk berserker has just scouted them out, seen their traces, and is now reporting to their leader. The party decides to investigate, and as they go down the path where they suspect the enemies to be, rightly so, they are very cautious. They find where the Seafolk have been gathered. It is a small room around a hot spring, and they see the new corpse. It seems the Seafolk didn't have time to drag them out. And clearly they left in a hurry, as a lot of their belongings are still left here. At this point, there's only one path forward, and presumably the Seafolk went there. As the party continues, they reach another tomb area with a tunnel branching off. As they enter the intersection, two Seafolk warriors jump from the tomb area alcove and charge the group. Initiative is rolled, but because both groups knew the other was there, they just weren't sure exactly where. Neither side gets a surprise attack, a surprise round advantage. The group begins to fight these Seafolk, and they aren't too much of a challenge. However, there are more in the offshoot tunnel ahead, which is the only way forward, as the group will find out, who spring into action. You see, my plan as a dungeon master had been to let the group fight the first group at the hot spring, and the rest up ahead as two separate encounters. However, when the players fought the Banshee first and alerted the group of Seafolk that were at the spring, that group ran ahead to report to their leader, while their strongest warrior, the Berserker, scouted them out and reported back. Now, the Seafolk know that a group of enemies are coming, and they are more prepared than they would have otherwise been. As the fight begins, the group quickly kills the two Seafolk that have ambushed them. However, the artificer Watna runs through the tunnel quickly with their familiar as well, and they find themselves in a new little offshoot room, facing up against a clearly very well-trained warrior. This is the Berserker. If I'm a good video editor, I'll put up a picture of what I've used to describe and show to the players for this Berserker Seafolk. Unlike normal Seafolk, he has a breastplate armor on and is well-trained and tanky. He has more HP than any of the group members, for that matter. And additionally, up ahead are another normal warrior and the leader of the group, a Seafolk priest named Ishtul, although the players never learn their name. And this is the leader of the expedition, and they are hiding up ahead. And this is a good sign that things are about to get a little rough. You've split up the group into 2 little mini combats. One of the players, who's not the tankiest, although they're fine, has run up ahead, and things are about to get a little rough. After killing the last of the 2 ambushing Seafolk, Verdun runs through the tunnel as well, and joins Watna in fighting the Berserker and the other warrior. Watna, on the other hand, chooses to retreat. With the flanking rules we use, this has the unintended consequence of having it where Verdun is flanked by the Berserker, who moves into the doorway of the tunnel after Watna and cuts off Verdun from the rest of the group. It is a little bit of a weird thing, though, because although Verdun is flanked by the warrior on one hand, so it's like you have the warrior, Verdun, the Berserker, and then Watna, and then the rest of the group. The rest of the group can kind of support with fire, and sure, the Berserker is flanked as well, but the Berserker is a little tankier than the rest of the group is, and again, he can take these hits for a while. Really, the one who is sort of out of luck here is Verdun. He's not in a good spot. He's already taken a few hits from those ambushers. And as the Seafolk priest enters the fight, he casts multiple spells on Verdun. He uses first, I believe he used first spiritual weapon, and then attacked, and the next round did a action attack. I can't remember what it was. It might have been inflict wounds. I'm not sure if he even hit with that, but either the way, between the warrior and the priest, Verdun goes down. And this is a big problem because he is behind enemy lines, and there's no way for anyone to reach him to heal him. I believe that possibly Gamdulfo could have brought him up with healing words, but Gamdulfo is sort of at the back of the group, and this is not going to be easy. At this point, additionally, all the players are pretty beat up. I think all of them are about half health, and the Berserker is still well above half health. And beyond this, the players know out of character and in character. I described that their characters know. Seafolk are pretty vicious. I've described this before. Seafolk are essentially similar to the Sahagin of my world. If you've played a lot of 5e in like the mainstream settings, such as Faerun or other settings, then Sahagin are sort of like vicious. They don't really take prisoners. They are cultists, essentially. Seafolk in general in my world are like this. However, there are some more complexities, I like to think, in the Seafolk of my world, and maybe the players will learn about that eventually. But the Seafolk are pretty hateful of humans, especially. So they're not too hopeful about this whole situation for Verdun, because they're like, well, they might just kill him, and that's how Seafolk are a lot of the times. So, to their surprise, when it reaches the priest's turn, and he's behind his tanky minion with a downed PC, I describe it like this. The priest reaches down, picks up Verdun, holds a dagger to his throat, and then casts a spell to stabilize him. And now Verdun is no longer dying. He uses the spell Spare the Dying, which stabilizes. It doesn't bring the player conscious, the character conscious, but it stabilizes them. And the players are all surprised with this. They're like, what is going on? Why is he doing this? Mind you, he still has a dagger to Verdun's throat. The Seafolk priest calls out in a fairly fluent Vellecan, the lingua franca of the Middle Sea, and essentially calls for a temporary truce, a ceasefire. The players agree and begin to negotiate. Now, the players are somewhat surprised by how reasonable these supposed savages actually are, but keep in mind, we don't know why these specific Seafolk are here with a well-trained berserker and a priest, right? This is not a normal raiding group. They're on a mission, like the party. Essentially, the priest tells the group that although he thinks either group could win in the fight, as it's been pretty even, he doesn't really feel like risking dying, and he assumes that the party doesn't either. Perfectly reasonable, right? He asks the group if they've killed the rest of the patrol from earlier, and the group, of course, admits, well, yeah, we did. They think this is a bad thing, and to be fair, the Berserker and the Warrior both start kind of like putting their hands on their weapons again. Like, they're pissed off. Their brethren have been slashed down by these heathens. But the priest he obviously doesn't care too much about the cost of life and is kind of more disappointed than anything. And realizes the position that they're in. If anything, this is a good thing for the group because the priest is the one in charge, and he's more reasonable than the berserker or the warrior. He essentially tells the group that they'll give them their friend back if they're allowed to leave peacefully, if the Seafolk can leave peacefully. And he even tosses them a potion as a measure showing good faith. The players are not in a great spot, and they don't really want to risk dying, even though they don't think that they are guaranteed to lose. And they accept, and the Seafolk go on their way. In their negotiations, the players try to pry a bit about why the Seafolk were there, and although they didn't get any concrete information, they definitely have their suspicions. It's a bit convenient that these Seafolk are here at the same entrance at the same time, going the same direction as the party. There was also a perception check I had that the players make related to an item the priest was handling in their pocket during the negotiations. And if the players had seen it, it could have made things turn out a bit differently. But dice rolls are random and no one saw it. Let's just say there was maybe a pocket-sized NPC in one of the satchels of the priest. And if you have a guess about what that is, I'd be interested to know what you think it is. And maybe I'll tell you in the comments if your guess is close enough. After this, the players rested and then continued exploring. Let's take a second to talk a bit about that last bit of a negotiation that happened there between the players and this group of Seafolk. While it was obvious while it could seem to the players like I was pulling punches or going easy on them, it's a bit more than that. Definitely I was, a little bit, because I realized that in this situation we were probably going to have a character death at this point, and I thought it was a little too early in the campaign to have that. But there is more to it than that. In the past, the players have teased me about how my enemy groups are always very fanatical, right? They're always very fight to the death, even when it's clear you've lost. I've not been good about representing goblins who will surrender once they realize they've lost, or other cowardly creatures forced to fight surrendering when they have no choice, right? And that's a valid criticism. Most people who aren't berserkers, fanatics, or cultists, right, shouldn't fight, or demons or devils, which basically come back in my world, right, who don't really have a reason to fear death. People who have a reason to fear death, which is most people, should probably not try to fight to the death in general. They should be reasonable, and it makes the world more believable if enemies try to retreat or surrender. And that's definitely something I've wanted to improve upon, and it was sort of at the back of my hand here. And think about it like this. While most Seafolk are fairly vicious, that's definitely true about my world, these are trained Seafolk, and they're being led by a religious leader who is fairly wise and smart. Obviously, in the mind of this religious Seafolk priest, they've lost more than half their men, and they're not very well equipped for what they know is going to be ahead in this grueling dungeon. With only half their crew and already having lost a couple other Seafolk to other causes, which you'll find out, you already know one, the Banshee, and you'll find out another one in a bit, they know that they don't really have a good chance anyways, and now they're potentially all going to die. Of course, when the priest sees an opportunity, he sees a hostage right there, bleeding out but not dead. Of course he's going to take him and negotiate a safe escape. They know there's no win, but they can live if they use this opportunity that just presented itself. So I thought it made sense, and it adds to the verisimilitude of the world. Reasonable creatures will take reasonable actions to benefit themselves and to avoid death especially. Additionally, I think that letting these Seafolk leave could add some emphasis to a dramatic moment that will be coming up in a few sessions. And I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to use them, but stay tuned. I'm sure they will come back at some point for some reason, possibly. As the party goes up to the next level of the dungeon, they realize that there are bones all over the ground and rubble all over the ground in this narrow corridor that they find themselves in, and they proceed with caution, especially when they realize that a lot of these bones are gnawed on. They think there might be some critters down here. However, as they reach a wider portion of the dungeon, about 15 feet wide instead of 5 feet wide, with these large corridors and stuff, there are no bones and only a little bit of rubble. Not nearly as much rubble as there was in these small little tunnels and corridors. The floors seem fairly clean. If you're an experienced or an old-school D&D player, your instincts are probably tingling right now. As the players head down a corridor, they run into a simple encounter. A bunch of giant rats gnawing on a fresh Seafolk corpse. This is the furthest the Seafolk got before retreating down below to regroup and plan, and you know the rest about what happened to the rest of the Seafolk. These rats attack the group, and while the encounter wasn't ever going to be life-threatening, these rats are really only the size of like large dogs, right? Gamdulfo uses a spell that makes it really trivial even. Sleep. The sleep spell essentially knocks out half the rats in the combat, and the group is free to take their time. However, the last one starts to run away, taking them into a huge gathering hall that has collapsed columns and even a collapsed roof in the middle of the room. The middle of the room has essentially collapsed in, and now there's only a small little gap near the top right of, if you're looking at it, the top right of the wall, where the wall meets this rubble in the ceiling. And there's maybe a 10 by 10 gap where someone could easily fit in, but you'd have to climb up a pile of rubble and then pass into the other area. And as the group runs into this room, the rat tries to scurry up this pile of rubble, but with a lucky shot, I believe it might have been a javelin throw or a hand axe throw or something, then the rat goes down. However, before the players can fully react or realize that they're out of combat, they see movement coming from the other side of that gap onto their side. They see a skeleton, hand outstretched to the group as it glides over the rubble into their section of the room, suspended a few feet in the air. This presentation of this monster is something that I also took directly from Matt Colville. If you haven't seen his videos, he talks about how he always presents this monster with a skeleton going, ooh, with a hand outstretched. And I find it great because at first the players are like, is this some sort of minor lich or something? Are we screwed? Because that would obviously be terrifying and unfair to them. However, the players all succeed on, I think all except one, I don't remember who, but they almost all succeed on a perception check, and they realize this is not a skeleton floating through the air. This is a skeleton suspended in a giant cube of gelatinous material. This is a gelatinous cube, a classic Dungeons & Dragons monster. And again, I'm sure if you've played a lot of D&D, when I described the fact that a lot of the rubble and bones were gone in the main corridor, makes sense now, right? The cube is essentially the janitor of the dungeon and essentially moves through, eats stuff up, but it can't fit in the smaller corridors. Because as the players sort of make checks to see how much they know about gelatinous cubes, they realize, or Watna realizes, Watna, the Dwarven Artificer, rolls really high, and I decided to explain it well. You were part of a artificer order in a large empire. You probably experimented on some gelatinous cubes. And, the group's like, okay, that makes sense. And I explained to Watna how this is a much larger one than he's ever seen, and is probably fairly dangerous. The players honestly could have beaten it, but I didn't really want this to turn into a combat. And it didn't. The players start to run away. They run off, they start to run into, towards the end of the hall, where there is this large door that has a bunch of, it's clearly an ornate door, and they're like, okay, it looks sturdy enough, we could probably hide behind it. But they see a warning scribbled hastily on the outside on either side of the door. It says on one side, death awaits, or, expect death. Or be wary of death, kind of, right? It's written in Old Vellecan, essentially the Latin of my world. And on the other side it says elven traps. The players are quickly like, okay, let's turn this way into this hallway, and they run into a hallway and decide to hide and just let the cube kind of move on its way. They take some pot shots, but eventually the cube moves on, and they listen and kind of peek out to see where it goes, and it goes up and down a different corridor. And after a moment, what is weird is they hear some squealing, some loud and deep squealing and grunting, and then silence. And they're kind of wondering what is going on here. After a moment of waiting, they continue to explore. They don't actually enter the room with the warnings written on it, which may be a little sad, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But they rather go in the direction that they hear the fighting. As they round the corner, we ended the session, and they wouldn't find out till next time what had happened with the cube and the squealing. So to go over the other aspects of DMing lessons, I do think that there's a lesson to be learned here about unexpected situations. I had expected the players to see the red flags of the Banshee room, the Seafolk corpse, the one magical weapon surrounded by dead bodies and rusted weapons, the bones laying around, and the scribbling on the wall. And I expected them to leave it and come back later and deal with the more pressing threat, the Seafolk. But they didn't, and of course this changed the trajectory of the session. Now, instead of there being 2 separate encounters for the Seafolk, it ended up being one big one. Instead of 2 warriors and a berserker, which would have been easy enough, followed by 2 warriors and a priest, which would have been easy enough, it became 3 warriors, the berserker, and the priest all at once. Minus, of course, the 4th warrior who had died from the Banshee's scream. Now this did end up, again, this makes it a lot trickier, and it made the combat a lot tougher. But here's the thing, and this is the lesson that I think I've learned over the past couple years of DMing. If you put in enough time to knowing why are your enemies here, what do they care about, how much are they willing to sacrifice to reach their goals, then you can know when you can reasonably pull your punches without seeming like you're taking it easy on a meta level, right? So in this situation, I knew that these cultists, or rather these they're not really cultists, but these Seafolk and their priest are not the type who will fight to the death, at least not under the command of a reasonable priest. And so I knew I could kind of take it easy on the group at this point. Although I again came up with that in the moment. I knew that because of the fact that I knew their motivations and I knew what these Seafolk were like compared to most other Seafolk. And it goes to show that you can easily work around unexpected consequences as long as you kind of think these things through, even if something takes you by surprise. It's also worth pointing out that I didn't give inspiration for the caltrops play until after the session, until the next session, rather. Between sessions, I realized it was a clever use of gear that I didn't account for, didn't plan for, and hadn't expected, and I figured it was worth rewarding. I've been pretty bad in the past about rewarding inspiration at the end of sessions, so I decided, you know what, like, inspiration doesn't have any hard set rules on it, and I can change them even if there are. I decided, you know what, in the future, I'm not going to worry about rewarding inspiration at the end of a session, because sometimes I might not be thinking about that, right? I think in the future, I'll wait until I think of something that was worthy of inspiration and reward it. For those of you who don't know, by the way, if you're new to D&D, inspiration is essentially, you start with inspiration, at least in my campaign, and it's essentially you can use a reroll once or give yourself advantage, which means you roll twice and take the higher. I play it that you can use it for either of those two things. You can either get one reroll or give yourself essentially a double roll and you take the higher. And you can do that once with one inspiration, and you can't hoard them. You can only have one inspiration, so you're incentivized to use it. And because I've been bad about giving it out again, players often in my campaigns forget that it's there. So I decided I want to start giving it away again, and I'm going to be a little lax about how or when I reward it, but I will reward inspiration retroactively. The last thing I'll mention that is not necessarily DMing related, well, it is a bit, is regarding that door with the warnings at the end of the session that they ran past. What the players don't know, I was a little disappointed that they didn't go into that room because there was something in there. There is both a combat encounter and a nice reward, a pretty good reward in there. And although it made me sad that the players skipped this and never came back to it, as I know from having played out the next 2 sessions, I'll let you in on a secret of DMing. It's perfectly reasonable and even sometimes necessary to take something that the players never found and then go zoop and stick it somewhere else in the same dungeon or a different dungeon or rework it somehow, and they won't know the difference because obviously they never went into that room. I am not going to be reusing the combat encounter from that, but the object that was in that room guarded is definitely something I want the players to at least have a chance to use. It's something I think is pretty interesting that I came up with for my world. And in Campaign Diary 4, you will find out what this item is, and I'll let you know which one it is then. I'll refer to it as the item that used to be in that other room. But for now, let's just say that it will not seem as dangerous as it could potentially be. And in Campaign Diary 4, if you're listening to that when it comes out, I would love to see if you can guess what it is before I say it. In any case, that'll be all for the second Campaign Diary. Again, I hope you found this entertaining, or at least a bit useful. This first arc of the campaign, it looks like it'll end up being like 5 sessions or so, is very dungeon crawly and sort of a linear adventure, and it's definitely a bit combat heavy. But in the next session, there will be some roleplay. We've already done 2 more sessions, and there was some roleplay in the 3rd session, a good bit, and I think you'll enjoy that if you like roleplay. And so I look forward to seeing that. And as always, feel free to leave a like or share this video, or feel free to give me feedback or criticism or suggestions. And I would love to see you in the next video. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.